Well, I've been thinking a lot about what makes for a good argument lately, but for me, I think it comes a lot from the fact that I've been doing so much more quote unquote like semi-public or public speaking in the context of doing this podcast. So I've been considering how I can make my speech more impactful, for instance. Yet what's occurred to me is that there's sort of a dilemma here in that it's not clear to me whether the best argument or what makes a good argument is an argument that really conclusively demonstrates the truth of something, or whether it's an argument that's just persuasive, because these aren't always the same thing.
So I guess I'm not really that interested in the persuasion side.
Okay,
Uh,
good, good.
the, I mean, although considerations will come up. So suppose that I'm an apologist, and it doesn't matter what I'm an apologist for, what side of any dispute that you like. But what I really want to do is just make people agree with me, right? I want them to
Hmm.
take on my views. That's my goal, because I think that there's something important at stake that goes along with believing these things. Um, then what's my best strategy? Well, what I really want is just to find out whatever's going to make you change your mind. And argument might actually just not be a very good strategy. I mean, leave aside for the moment exactly what argument is. It might be much better if I just tell you stories that might of a certain kind. That might work
Right.
way better to persuade you.
Yeah. Or use force.
Yeah, well,
So,
there's that. Indeed, right? I mean, if I'm, I don't know, let's pick Muhammad. If I conquer Northern Africa and wait long enough, it's very likely that most people will end up with the religious beliefs that I want them to have, just because we've, taken over the land, and especially if we don't go about, if we're not too strong on enforcing our views to start with, but we make it clear that there are advantages like tax advantages and things like that. If you end up right after a couple of generations, we'll probably have lots of believers. So yeah, I agree on that one too.
hmm. So that you have two questions. I mean, the two questions were what makes an argument worth discussing and what makes a good argument. Supposes that the good arguments and the arguments worth discussing aren't they don't also necessarily coincide. So you might also be very interested in discussing bad arguments
Ah,
or arguments that are something other than good.
yeah, indeed. Right. And I guess that's a way of letting back in historical arguments that have been very influential. Arguments that seem clearly, to most people, like they just can't be right. But it's very hard to see why they're not right. So, I mean, one example that we may come to is the argument in Proslogion 2, Anselm's argument, about which most people, even if they're theists, think it's kind of it's, it's too good to be true that this is
Hmm.
a you know that this is a successful argument, right? So there's that kind of consideration.
Hmm. Yeah, so I suppose then, since you remain an atheist, you must, on some level, think all of the ontological arguments for God are bad, at least in the sense that they don't conclusively demonstrate their conclusion. They might be ingenious on some level, but they're not successful.
Right. So at least two of these arguments, the one in Proslogion 2 and the Gödel argument, are definitely ingenious in my
Yeah.
view. But I don't think that either of them is such as ought to persuade an informed opponent to change their mind. And because it shouldn't lead an informed opponent to change their mind, I think it also shouldn't lead an informed person who's sitting on the fence to change their mind either.
Hmm.
Right. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
So I guess we'll get into these things later, but I did notice I was looking at your books. I was looking at ontological arguments and belief in God, and then I looked at arguing. Is it arguing with the God? Arguing
About
about
gods.
gods.
Yeah.
about gods. And I saw that that Gödel's argument wasn't in the first, but it was in the second. So I was really glad that I saw that, because that was one that
So
I wanted to get
it,
to eventually.
it's in the notes. There's a footnote. Like the notes section in that book is enormous. It's longer than the main text. And I wrote the book in the early 90s, and that was just when the literature on the Gödel argument was starting to take off. Um,
Hmm.
so, yeah, if I did a revised edition, it would get a chapter. In fact, I mean, higher order arguments generally would get a big chapter, but timing. I didn't start writing about and really thinking about the Gödel argument until after that book came out.
Hmm. So we talked a bit about the bad argument side of things, but what then, granted you're still in the midst of this project, do you have any firm ideas yet about what you think might make for a good argument?
Okay, so I guess the first thing that we need to do is to work out what we're talking about when we're talking about argument. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
because there's a couple of different things that we could be talking about. I mean, and part of my project has been looking at what people say in different disciplines about
Hmm.
arguments. And so here's one thought about what an argument is. An argument is the kind of thing that's given in, say, an essay, where you're um, saying why you favour a particular claim, right? And that's an argument, right? Now, that's not, I think, the way that philosophers think about argument, right?
Right.
So the way that philosophers think about arguments generally is we have a set of premises and a conclusion, and um, and then there's some kind of connection between the conclusion and the premises. And when we're evaluating arguments, we're thinking about those abstract, relatively abstract objects. And it's not necessarily the case that you can take an essay and say, okay, these are the premises, that's the conclusion. All the essay is doing is advancing that argument. In fact, that rarely turns out to be the case, I think. So,
Hmm.
um, in the kind of everyday, in a kind of more everyday sense, um, I think that when people are arguing, often what they're doing is just trading reasons, and uh, that's, I think, that primitive sense of arguing or argument uh, often seems to be a bit divorced from the philosophical conception of a premise set, um, conclusion, and you kind of can't take. So to take an example, suppose that we've agreed that we're going into the city to have lunch, and we're in the house, and it's about, and we haven't left for the station yet. It's going to take us 10 minutes to get to the station. And you look at this is an old fashioned example. So you look at your watch and you say, okay, it's time to go to the station, right? And I look at my watch and I say, no, it isn't. And you say, but look, it's 1:45, and we're going to need 10 minutes to get to the station. And I say, no, it's only 1:30. Right? And so now we've got a problem, right there. And now I imagine we can easily resolve this disagreement. So in some way, for example, because we've got phones, we pull out our phones and we look and we see that actually both our phones say that it's 1:45. Obviously, my watch has stopped, and that's the right conclusion. We resolve our disagreement that way. In a kind of everyday sense, we had an argument, and then we resolved it by considering the reasons that we had for holding our beliefs and sort of comparing the reasons. And we worked out that one of us had a good reason, the other one didn't. Um, so I think that there's a lot in that for a kind of useful conception of argument.
Hmm.
But what does it have to do with the philosophical conception of argument? Where that philosophical conception where we're talking about premises and conclusion. If you open up a textbook on informal logic or critical thinking or something like that, what it will typically say is Okay, an argument's a set of premises and a conclusion. What makes an argument good is something about the relationship between the conclusion and the premises and the status of the premises. They're the two things you have to think
Mm-hmm.
about. And the first bit, the relation between the premise and the conclusion, some people will say it's just this has got to be a kind of logical connection. Other people think there are other kinds of arguments, probabilistic
Something
arguments,
formal.
or I don't know, inference to the best explanation or things like that. There's a kind of debate about whether there really is that other kind of arguments, but we'll sort of put that to one side. Okay, so kind of logic maybe. So you said something formal. If that's what we're thinking, formal logic, that will tell you whether you've got the
Yeah.
right connection between the premises and the conclusion. But what about this other thing, the properties of the premises? There's
Yeah.
various things
That.
that you might say. You might say they've got to be true. You might say they've got to be such that any rational person would believe them. There's a whole range of things that you might say. And often that's the kind of definitional framework for discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Something's already gone wrong at that point, I think, because that leaves out what I think is a really important class of arguments. And some textbooks don't notice this, others do, but say, it's a special case and we can ignore it. The case where what I do is I take a bunch of claims that you're committed to and show that they entail absurdity or contradiction. Right? That's a really good style of argument, but it's not one where we're worried about the virtues of the premises. Right? What we're worried about is the fact that you believe them all. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that actually is kind of suggestive of a different way of thinking about what makes for a good argument. And so I'm going to think about it in this two-person context where I'm giving the argument to you. It'll be useful for me to give you an argument from things that you believe to something that you haven't noticed that you're committed to by the things that you already believe. If it turns out to be absurdity, this is particularly helpful because you kind of realize you better be revising something. But even if it's not, you're not
Mm-hmm.
having noticed that this thing follows from the things, right? Now, that's actually what something like that is where I think the utility of the philosophical conception of argument comes in. And the other thing about, soundness or something like that is actually not particularly useful when we're thinking about argument in terms of exchange. Right? So I actually want to play quite a bit with the standard way that we think about arguments. Oh no,
Mm-hmm.
was that clear enough?
No, that was quite clear. I was also just thinking. I mean, taking a mathematical example or mathematical situation as an example, like an argument in math, it follows quite closely the arguments in logic. Well, particularly because I'm thinking of math logic, but
Yeah.
an argument in set theory, you have your axioms, and then you show a conclusion. But it's a very different sort of argument when you decide which set theory you want to operate with, which axioms you want to take as true. These are different sorts of arguments because they're not within the formal system itself.
Right. So, and I agree 100%. Like my undergraduate degree, one of them was in maths. Uh, um, and it's nice in maths because you've got a whole bunch of stuff that everybody accepts, and then you're deriving stuff from the stuff that everybody already accepts. And that's what proofs are. As you point out, where there's questions about whether we should accept something or not, the kinds of considerations that we now advance are going to be really different. They'll often turn out to be, for example, how fruitful it is if we suppose that this thing is going to be, axiom of choice or whatever it is. We can
Mm-hmm.
try and do math without it, but these days
Mm-hmm.
hardly anybody's going to bother.
Yeah. It also uh, it experience tells me we tend to rely on things like intuition and that aren't easily fleshed out in argumentative form.
and there are kind of worries about that. So there's this, Ramanujan had amazing mathematical intuition, but
Mm-hmm.
when it came to the um, it's stuff in infinity. Um,
Mm-hmm.
his intuition actually led him astray. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think that it's kind of interesting because I have friends who are mathematicians and they talk about insight all the time, but I'm not sure that they think that intuition carries much weight. I mean, insight is a kind of on the discovery side of trying to work out what you need to prove, but if you can't prove it, right,
Mm-hmm.
it really, I mean, I guess it's a conjecture. That's all it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it just doesn't have the same standing in the mathematical community as if you've proved something.
Mm-hmm. I think something else that's quite interesting about I can't pronounce his name properly, Ramanujan, is that something, maybe I'm totally misquoting this, but his intuitions were like 98% right for these
Yeah.
very, very complicated problems, and he had no way of uh, proving them. It was just something that he seemed to know, and that was a big difficulty for him in working with other mathematicians.
Although he found people who eventually could figure out how to prove the things he said were true.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right.
But yeah, that I believe that's right.
Mm-hmm. No, no, I'm totally on board with you for so far in your characterization of philosophical argument. But just as we had to define argument, now I think we have to define good.
Yeah.
So, what makes a good argument, and where are you in that line of thought
Okay,
at the
so
moment?
for the case where you haven't noticed that something follows from things that you're committed to, and let's suppose follows logically. I mean, it'd be harmless to assume that. Then a good argument is going to be one that starts from things that you believe and reaches a conclusion that you don't accept. It won't be much use if I show you that from a mix of things that you believe and things you don't believe, a certain thing follows that you don't accept, because then you should just shrug your shoulders and say, well, but I don't believe that and I don't believe that. Right. So that would be,
Mm-hmm.
so that's what I'm thinking is the kind of difference between the standard textbook conception of good argument and what I'm proposing that we should say instead, right? It's not the properties of the premises, whether they're true or something like that. It's just rather whether your audience, the person that you're speaking to in the one-on-one case, accepts them or not. That's what matters. And so when I give you a proof of the existence of God and you look at it and you say, no, but I don't believe that first thing, then I need a different argument at that point. That's what I think. And this is not the method that I was following exactly in arguing about gods or in the book on ontological arguments, but it was reflecting on what had happened in those books. This was the view that I came to subsequently.
Mm-hmm. And the sorts of arguments that you were just discussing rely on your ability to show your interlocutor that something is true that they did not maybe want to accept as true.
Well, I guess
Or am I
I
wrong
mean, I
here?
guess if it's showing that absurdity follows from their beliefs, I'm sure they didn't want that to be true. Uh,
Okay.
in another case, though, sometimes it might not be that. Sometimes it might be that you can help them out by showing them that, they thought that they needed some independent justification to accept a certain claim. But look, it follows from things that you're already committed to, that you're committed to this claim.
Okay.
So
So a good argument is one in which you take something that your interlocutor believe, well, a set of premises
yeah,
that your interlocutor can agree with, and you show them something that they didn't know that
yeah.
provides some use to them.
And so maths will all fit into that, right? When you prove a new
Hmm.
result, uh, although I mean, setting Ramanujan aside, people who know them know the truth before you prove it. But supposing that we're not sure, and then Wiles produces his proof, right? After a
Hmm.
while, we agree
Right.
that it's a proof, and now we're confident, right? So,
Hmm.
so that would fit this characterization.
Now, I think I'm totally with you at this point. And is there something further that you're seeking to do with this analysis, or are you currently just working on uh, arguing for your analysis
Yeah,
more
so
thoroughly?
so I'm so that's it's a bit of a challenge to know how to argue for it. Where I think this argue now is in the kind of persuade basket rather than the yeah.
Hmm.
So what the rhetorical strategy is kind of tricky, but I do think that it will have application in philosophy of religion because I
Oh,
think that
great.
lots of people aren't thinking about what groups or large groups or small groups of people who disagree with them, what their beliefs are, right? Because good practice is going to be first find out what other people believe, because otherwise you just risk producing arguments that are going to fail by this standard because you're arguing from premises they don't accept, right? So
Hmm.
you're not actually doing the useful thing. So I think that there's a kind of reform of practice where you really have to talk to people that disagree with you and find out what their claims are before you start thinking about whether you can show that their beliefs lead to contradiction or absurdity or something like that. Um, so one other thing I should note at this point, which is obvious to you but may not be obvious to everybody that's listening, is that where you've got a logical proof from a bunch of premises P1 through Pn to conclusion C, at least classically, if we take P1 through Pn and we add not C, then we get absurdity, contradiction
Hmm.
as a consequence. So we can think of any proof that you present to somebody in the standard format as a proof that's saying that their um, beliefs lead to absurdity on the assumption that they disagree with you about the conclusion, right? So a standard proof of the existence of God presented to me, I can hear it as from these premises and not C leads to absurdity. Should I be worried about that? Well, not if I don't accept some of the P's.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But
Well,
that's
I'm
classical, and you might not have a deduction theorem in some other sorts of logics. So.